Hello everyone, and here are the details of today's video. South Africa's decision to temporarily suspend participation in the G20 did not emerge as a sudden diplomatic gesture. It is the culmination of a deeper unease, a signal that Pretoria no longer accepts its role within a global order shaped overwhelmingly by Western preferences and American power. The announcement, understated in tone yet seismic in implication, reveals a profound truth. The world's emerging economies are losing faith in the structures meant to represent them. To understand this moment, one must look beneath the surface of diplomatic statements and examine the tensions that have quietly accumulated between South Africa and the United States. Washington's growing pressure on Pretoria, particularly over its position on the Ukraine war, its military exercises with Russia, and its alignment with BRICS, has been interpreted not as partnership, but as coercion. South Africa feels cornered, forced to choose between historical relationships and contemporary geopolitical demands. In withdrawing from the G20, even temporarily, it asserts that it will not be lectured into compliance. This move also exposes the fragility of the G20 itself, formed as a bridge between the developed and developing world. The G20 was intended to be inclusive, balanced, and globally representative. Yet in recent years, the institution has increasingly reflected the strategic priorities of the West. South Africa's withdrawal serves as an indictment of that imbalance. It is a reminder that frameworks built for global cooperation can lose legitimacy when they appear to privilege some voices over others. The timing of Pretoria's decision is particularly striking. The world is already fractured by geopolitical rivalry, economic fragmentation, and competing visions of international order. For South Africa to step back at such a moment signals that the country feels unprotected, not only from external criticism, but from the possibility of retaliatory measures. It understands well that the United States wields significant economic leverage, access to financial markets, development loans, and trade preferences. The fear of retaliation is not imaginary. It is informed by the experiences of nations that crossed U.S. strategic lines in the past. Yet South Africa's action is not simply defensive, it is also expressive. It is a declaration that the country refuses to be drawn into the gravitational pull of American foreign policy at the expense of its own interests, its own identity, and its own regional responsibilities. Pretoria's worldview is shaped by the legacy of anti-apartheid struggle, by solidarity with the global South, and by a belief that global governance must reflect more than the will of a few powerful states. In stepping back from the G20, South Africa is expressing a broader sentiment felt across the developing world, the sense that global institutions have become arenas not of cooperation, but of geopolitical pressure. The withdrawal is a diplomatic whisper, but it echoes like a warning across continents. It signals that the fault lines in the international system are widening, not because nations reject cooperation, but because they seek a form of cooperation rooted in dignity, equality, and mutual respect. South Africa's message, understated yet unmistakable, is that global governance must evolve or risk losing those it claims to represent. South Africa's decision to step back from the G20 is intertwined with a quieter, more complex fear, one that stems not from ideology, but from the hard realities of global economic power. Pretoria does not fear the United States in a military sense. Instead, it fears the intricate web of financial, trade, and diplomatic tools. Washington has at its disposal tools that have been wielded effectively against nations that diverged from U.S. strategic expectations in the past. The United States commands a unique form of leverage. Its currency, its market, its financial institutions, and its influence over global narratives. Countries far larger and more economically resilient than South Africa, Turkey, Brazil, India, at moments of disagreement have all faced U.S. pressure in ways that disrupted their markets or reshaped their policy choices. South Africa knows this history well. It knows that a country deeply integrated into the Western financial system can be punished without any formal declaration of sanctions. The fear is therefore structural, not personal. Pretoria depends heavily on U.S. trade preferences, especially through programs that grant tariff-free access for South African exports. Agriculture, automotive, manufacturing, and mining pillars of the national economy are tied to American import policies. A single adjustment in Washington could ripple across South African industries, destabilizing employment and investment. In an economy already strained by unemployment, energy crises, and inequality, such a blow would be overwhelming. Beyond trade, South Africa remains linked to institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, whose governance structures reflect U.S. influence. Even if Washington never issues a direct threat, Pretoria knows that dissenting too boldly from U.S. geopolitical priorities can translate into indirect costs, slower financing, stricter conditions, or reduced diplomatic support in moments of crisis. Fear of retaliation often arises not from explicit confrontation, but from the subtle understanding of how global systems are wired. Yet there is another dimension to South Africa's anxiety, one that goes beyond economics. Pretoria senses that U.S. expectations are shifting. Washington views the Ukraine war as a moral struggle and expects partners to align accordingly. South Africa, whose foreign policy philosophy is grounded in non-alignment and historical solidarity with liberation movements, refuses to adopt this binary framing, but refusing comes with risk. To Washington, neutrality on Russia is increasingly seen as complicity. South Africa therefore fears not just retaliation, but misinterpretation. It fears being cast as a nation, choosing the wrong side in a polarized world. Such framing would carry diplomatic and reputational consequences that could affect investment, partnerships, and regional influence. Pretoria is acutely aware that narratives shape power, sometimes more forcefully than policy itself. Still, South Africa's withdrawal from the G20 shows that while the fear is real, it is not paralyzing. Pretoria has chosen a path that asserts autonomy even under the shadow of American influence. In doing so, it reveals the layered nature of modern global power, how nations seek to navigate between sovereignty and vulnerability, between principle and pragmatism. South Africa's unease does not mean it seeks confrontation. It means it seeks breathing room space to define its own politics without being coerced into the orbit of any superpower. And the decision to step back from the G20 reflects a deeper message. The world's emerging nations are no longer willing to accept partnership on unequal terms, no matter how powerful the partner may be. South Africa's decision to step back from the G20 is not simply an act of frustration. It is also a geopolitical signal, one that the BRICS nations immediately recognize as a strategic opening. In the eyes of Beijing and Moscow, Pretoria's discomfort with Western pressure serves as a powerful narrative, a reminder that the global South is chafing under the weight of institutions designed in earlier eras, shaped by priorities not their own. This moment offers BRICS an extraordinary chance to demonstrate unity, purpose, and relevance. China is the first to see the opportunity. Beijing views South Africa not merely as a partner, but as an anchor of Chinese influence on the African continent. Any rift between Pretoria and Washington strengthens China's strategic position. Beijing will likely respond with offers of economic partnership, soft loans, infrastructure investment, expanded access to Chinese markets, and deeper integration into the BRICS Development Bank. China's message is consistent. You have alternatives to Western pressure. For South Africa, this reassurance carries weight in moments of geopolitical vulnerability. Russia interprets South Africa's move through a different lens, one focused more on symbolism than economics. Moscow has long portrayed the Western-led order as hypocritical and exclusionary. Pretoria's withdrawal gives the Kremlin ammunition to argue that even democratic nations of the global South feel alienated by U.S. expectations. Expect Russia to amplify political support, public endorsements, diplomatic backing, and a renewed push for South Africa to shape BRICS' foreign policy posture. Moscow understands that Pretoria's independence, even symbolic, strengthens the narrative of a multipolar world. India approaches the situation with more caution. New Delhi values BRICS as a counterweight to Western dominance, yet it also maintains deep economic and strategic ties with the United States. India is unlikely to confront Washington directly on South Africa's behalf. Instead, it will adopt a role of mediator, encouraging dialogue, dampening tensions, and reinforcing BRICS cohesion without escalating confrontation. India's priority is not ideological alignment, but stability within the bloc. Brazil is the most ideologically aligned with South Africa's discomfort. Under its current leadership, Brazil shares Pretoria's frustration with Western political pressure and favors a more multipolar economic order. Brasilia will likely push BRICS to issue statements of solidarity, advocate reforms in global governance, and support South Africa diplomatically. Brazil sees in Pretoria's move a mirror of its own grievances, a desire for global institutions that respect sovereignty and emerging economic realities. Collectively, BRICS sees a larger prize, the chance to present itself as an alternative framework to the G20, one that claims to give voice to emerging markets without the geopolitical conditionalities tied to Western institutions. South Africa's temporary disengagement becomes a catalyst, an opportunity to showcase BRICS as a partner based on respect rather than coercion. Yet, what makes this moment especially significant is not the support BRICS may offer, but the message it sends to the world. The developing nations are watching closely. They see South Africa's gesture not as rebellion, but as a test of whether BRICS can become a true counterweight in global governance. If BRICS steps forward decisively, it will deepen its legitimacy. If it hesitates, it risks appearing divided and symbolic. South Africa's action is in many ways a referendum on BRICS itself, its coherence, its ambitions, and its capacity to shape the global future. The G20 now finds itself facing a crisis it was never designed to manage. the quiet rebellion of a member state that no longer believes the institution represents its interests. South Africa's withdrawal is not simply a diplomatic inconvenience. It is a warning shot. It signals that the very legitimacy of the G20, once celebrated as the most inclusive forum for global economic governance, is being eroded by the geopolitical pressures it was meant to transcend. At the heart of this dilemma lies a structural contradiction. The G20 was created to bridge the divide between the world's wealthiest nations and its most influential emerging economies. Yet, as geopolitical tensions intensify, the institution increasingly reflects the priorities of the West. South Africa's frustration is therefore symptomatic of a broader imbalance. The global South feels it is invited to the table, but not permitted to shape the agenda. The immediate challenge for the G20 is to prevent South Africa's temporary suspension from becoming a contagious gesture. Other emerging economies, Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, harbor similar frustrations about Western dominance in global governance. If Pretoria's move is interpreted as a viable path to reclaim strategic autonomy, the cohesion of the G20 could unravel. To stabilize the situation, quiet diplomacy will be essential. The G20 will likely facilitate back-channel exchanges between Washington and Pretoria, aiming to reduce political pressure on South Africa and address specific grievances. This may involve softening the tone of U.S. criticism regarding Pretoria's ties with Russia, offering more respectful dialogue on Ukraine, or acknowledging South Africa's legitimate concerns about unequal treatment within global institutions. At the same time, the G20 must confront the broader perception problem that it operates as an extension of Western influence rather than a platform for genuine multilateralism. To counter this, the body may need to increase Africa's representation in decision-making processes, strengthen the role of the African Union, and adopt policies that address the long-standing economic disparities between developed and developing nations. South Africa's withdrawal has exposed the moral and strategic necessity of such reforms, but the hardest challenge lies with the United States itself. Washington must balance its geopolitical objectives with the need to maintain trust within global forums. If the U.S. demands loyalty on issues like the Ukraine war while offering little flexibility or mutual respect, it risks alienating the very partners whose cooperation is essential for global stability. American diplomacy must shift from pressure to persuasion, from expectation to dialogue. Meanwhile, the G20 fears the growing gravitational pull of BRICS. If South Africa feels more empowered and respected within BRICS than within the G20, the symbolic weight of the group will tilt decisively away from Western-led institutions. The G20 is therefore not merely trying to placate Pretoria, it is trying to protect its relevance in a rapidly shifting global landscape. In the end, the future of the G20 hinges on whether it can evolve beyond its current political geometry. South Africa's withdrawal forces the question the institution has long avoided: will the G20 adapt to a multipolar world or fracture under the weight of its own asymmetries? Demands loyalty on issues like the Ukraine war while offering little flexibility or mutual respect. It risks alienating the very partners whose cooperation is essential for global stability. American diplomacy must shift from pressure to persuasion, from expectation to dialogue. Meanwhile, the G20 fears the growing gravitational pull of BRICS. If South Africa feels more empowered and respected within BRICS than within the G20, the symbolic weight of the group will tilt decisively away from Western-led institutions. The G20 is therefore not merely trying to placate Pretoria, it is trying to protect its relevance in a rapidly shifting global landscape. South Africa's decision to step back from the G20 is more than a regional dispute or an institutional embarrassment. It is a symptom of a world undergoing profound transformation, a world in which the old architecture of global governance is straining under the weight of new economic realities, shifting alliances, and the rising assertiveness of nations once relegated to the margins of power. The rift between Washington and Pretoria is not an isolated episode. It is a window into the emerging contours of a multipolar order. For decades, the post-Cold War narrative assumed that global institutions such as the G20 would evolve naturally into platforms of inclusive cooperation. But the events surrounding South Africa reveal a different truth. These institutions remain anchored in hierarchies inherited from earlier eras. As long as the United States maintains disproportionate influence over global finance, trade norms, and political expectations, emerging economies will continue to feel constrained by rules they did not craft and priorities they do not share. South Africa's action speaks to the growing assertiveness of the global South. Nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America increasingly reject the binary logic of geopolitical alignment. They seek strategic autonomy, economic flexibility, and diplomatic respect. Pretoria's withdrawal, though subtle in form, resonates deeply across these regions. It signals that middle powers are willing to challenge the asymmetries of global governance, not through confrontation, but through measured refusal. At the same time, this crisis underscores the widening gap between Western assumptions and global realities. The United States continues to frame conflicts such as Ukraine in moral and ideological terms, expecting universal alignment. Yet much of the world views these conflicts through pragmatic lenses, economic vulnerability, historical memory, and the desire to avoid becoming collateral in great power rivalries. South Africa's discomfort with U.S. pressure reflects this broader divergence in worldview. BRICS, meanwhile, emerges strengthened. Whether intentionally or not, South Africa has accelerated a process already underway, the creation of parallel institutions that can offer alternatives to Western-dominated systems. The BRICS Development Bank, the discussions around a shared currency, and the expansion of trade in non-dollar terms all gain momentum when countries feel marginalized within existing frameworks. South Africa's pause from the G20 becomes a symbolic endorsement of this shift, a move toward diversification, resilience, and balance. For the G20, the implications are sobering. It must now confront the reality that legitimacy is not granted by membership size or economic weight, but by fairness, respect, and shared purpose. The institution's ability to retain its influence will depend on whether it can adapt to the demands of a world that no longer accepts dominance disguised as multilateralism. Reform is no longer optional, it is existential. At the global level, the crisis reveals a deeper truth about the 21st century. Power is dispersing, and with it the authority to shape the rules of international life. South Africa's decision is not the cause of this transformation. It is merely one of its clearest expressions. The world is moving toward a decentralized, competitive, and pluralistic order in which no single bloc can dictate terms. Pretoria's quiet defiance therefore marks a turning point. it shows that even moderate powers can reshape global conversations when they refuse to be constrained by old expectations. And it signals that the future of global governance will be forged not in Washington or Brussels alone, but across a widening constellation of nations determined to claim their place in a new world, one aspiring not to dominance, but to dignity.